The lobby of the Fairmont Chateau Frontenac smelled the way money always smells. Old wood, fresh flowers, and the faint electrical hum of people who have never once worried about next month's rent. Tanner noticed it the moment the revolving door exhaled him into the atrium. Not the smell exactly. The weight of the place. The way the marble swallowed sound. The way the staff moved like they'd been choreographed. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and kept walking. Boone walked beside him, 91 pounds of German shepherd, jet-black saddle, amber eyes that moved in slow, deliberate arcs. His paws were nearly silent on the marble. His ears were up but not tense. He was reading the room the same way Tanner was. Cataloging, filing, dismissing. They had 4 days. 4 days before Tanner reported back to Halifax. 4 days before the uniform went back on, and the world compressed itself into mission briefs and equipment checks. His commanding officer had used the word vacation. Tanner hadn't corrected him. He wasn't sure he knew what that word meant anymore. The line at the front desk was short. 2 couples ahead of him, both with the kind of luggage that required its own rolling cart. Tanner stood with his single bag and watched Boone sit without being told, perfectly square, tail still. A woman to his left. Older, gray coat, sensible shoes, a canvas tote bag from a bookstore in Charlottetown, was struggling with the zipper on her purse. Her left hand moved slower than her right, a slight tremor. She noticed Tanner noticing and gave him the particular smile of someone who has spent decades preempting pity. "He's beautiful," she said, nodding at Boone.
"He knows it,"
Tanner said. She laughed. It was a real laugh. Her name was Audrey. She offered it the way some people offer their hand, naturally, without calculation. She was 73, she said, and she'd come from New Brunswick on a train because her daughter had booked her a room here as a birthday gift. She seemed slightly overwhelmed by the chateau and was doing an excellent job of not showing it. Boone leaned forward half an inch and sniffed her coat. Then he settled back. Tanner took that as a good sign. Boone's opinion of people was rarely wrong. There are places in the world that seem to exist specifically to remind certain people that they are more important than other people. The Frontenac, in its current moment, had attracted several of those people at once, which is the kind of thing that happens at heritage hotels in late October, when a conference on Canadian resource investment draws executives from Vancouver and Calgary and sends their spouses to the spa. The man's name was Harlan Wexford. He arrived in the lobby 20 minutes after Tanner, with a wheeled carry-on that probably cost more than Tanner's first car, a sport coat that fit like it had opinions, and a voice calibrated for rooms that were supposed to fall silent when he entered. The woman behind him was his wife. Tanner didn't learn her name until later. At this point, she was simply the woman in the cream blazer, who walked 2 steps back from Harlan and laughed at things he said before he finished saying them. Behind her were 2 men in their late 20s, Harlan's sons, as it turned out. Connor and the one everyone called Tripp, whose actual name, Tanner, never caught. They moved like young men who had grown up watching their father take up space and had decided to do the same. The Wexfords moved toward the concierge desk and the lobby rearranged itself slightly around them. Not dramatically, just enough. Tanner watched none of this consciously. He registered it the way he registered the angle of the light coming through the tall windows, or the fact that the woman in the gray coat, Audrey, was now seated in an armchair near the fireplace, waiting for her room to be confirmed, her canvas tote on her lap. He checked in. The staff at the desk were polite and professional, and said nothing about Boone beyond asking for his certification papers, which Tanner produced from the front pocket of his duffel without comment. Psychiatric service animal. The documentation was real. The diagnosis was real. Tanner thought of it as paperwork that described something he already knew about himself. They went upstairs. The dining room opened at 7. Tanner arrived at 5 past, because arriving exactly on time felt like a habit he only needed in certain contexts, and this was not one of them. He wore the same flannel shirt he'd arrived in. He hadn't brought anything fancier. It hadn't occurred to him. The maitre d' looked at the flannel. Then at Boone. Then back at Tanner. Tanner held his gaze for exactly the amount of time it takes for a person to reconsider. They were seated near the window. Boone settled under the table. Tanner ordered the duck. He opened the book he'd brought, a history of the Royal Canadian Navy, not recreational reading so much as professional interest, and had made it through 4 pages before he heard the voice. Harlan Wexford's voice carried. That was not a design flaw. That was the point. He and his family were being seated 3 tables over. The table they'd been given was good light, good sightline to the room, but Harlan appeared to feel it was not quite good enough. He was explaining this to the maitre d' with the patient, deliberate tone of a man who had discovered long ago that patience and deliberateness, delivered from a position of money, functioned as a kind of slow-motion threat. He wanted the corner table. The corner table had a reserved card on it. Harlan's patience did not waver. He explained that he understood the table was reserved and that he was confident something could be arranged. And he said the word confident the way a person says inevitable. The maitre d' disappeared, returned. The reserved card was removed. The family moved to the corner table. Tanner went back to his book. Audrey came in shortly after. She was wearing a cardigan now, pale blue. She was shown to a small table near the wall. A single diner's table, appropriate, but positioned slightly awkwardly behind a structural column. She sat down with the particular grace of someone who has decided to make the best of any room she's given. Tanner watched Boone's ears shift slightly, and then still. He went back to his book. The evening might have ended there. 4 days of this, and then back to Halifax. Duck. History of the Navy. Sleep. Then Tripp knocked Audrey's water glass off the edge of her table. He didn't mean to. That was almost certainly true. He was passing through the room with Connor, heading toward the bar, and his arm swung wide and caught the glass, and it hit the floor and shattered. What happened next was the part that mattered. Tripp looked at the glass, then at Audrey, who was leaning back in her chair, startled, her hand pressed to her chest. Then Tripp looked at Connor, and Connor made a face, a particular face, the kind that passes between 2 people who have been making that face at each other since childhood. And they both looked back at Audrey. "Careful," Tripp said, and then they walked on. No apology, no pause. Just careful, as if the glass had fallen because Audrey had been careless, as if the fault, if there was any fault, was hers for sitting there. A server came immediately with a cloth and began cleaning up, Audrey said. "Thank you, I'm fine, don't worry about me." She said it 3 times. She was looking down at the tablecloth. Tanner closed his book. He didn't move yet. He filed it. He watched Audrey pick up her menu and hold it slightly higher than before, so the top edge covered the lower half of her face. It was a small motion. She probably didn't know she was doing it. Boone's nose appeared above the table edge and then dropped back down. There are moments that don't look like what they are. This was one of them. It happened the following morning at breakfast. The dining room was busier. The conference had started, and the tables were full. Tanner arrived at 8 with Boone and was directed to a table near the kitchen, which he didn't mind. Boone didn't mind. The coffee arrived quickly, which was the only metric Tanner was tracking. Audrey came in at 8:15. She was shown to a different small table, better than the night before, tucked into a bay window overlooking the river. She settled in and ordered tea. Connor and Tripp appeared at 8:30. They had the energy of people who had been drinking until late and were now aggressively committed to performing wellness, both in athletic gear, both with the slightly too loud conversation of men re-establishing their presence in a space after sleep has temporarily erased it. They wanted the bay window table. Tanner heard Connor tell the hostess this. He heard the hostess explain that the table was occupied. He heard Connor say that it was just 1 person and that the table seated 4. And he heard the logic in his voice. Reasonable, friendly, practically generous if you thought about it, because surely a table for 4 was wasted on a single occupant, and the restaurant was busy. And really it was a matter of efficient use of space, wasn't it? The hostess hesitated. That hesitation was the moment. Tanner saw it. He saw the hostess glance toward the back, calculating whether the man at the corner table, Harlan, was watching. He saw her make the small, apologetic turn toward Audrey's table. He stood up before she got there. Not fast, not dramatically. He simply stood. He put 2 fingers to his thigh and Boone materialized beside him, already moving. He crossed the room in 8 steps. He stopped beside Audrey's table and looked at Connor. Connor looked back. He was a few inches shorter than Tanner and had the gym-built frame of someone who has spent a lot of time on machines, which is a different thing from the kind of fitness that comes from carrying weight through difficult terrain in the dark. Connor seemed to register this distinction somewhere below conscious thought, because he stopped talking mid-sentence. "Morning," Tanner said. Connor nodded, recalibrating. "We were just asking." "I heard," Tanner said. "This is her table." The way he said her table did not leave room for interpretation. It was not aggressive. It was not loud. It was simply accurate, and delivered with the certainty of someone who is not performing a position but occupying one. Boone sat beside Audrey's chair. Audrey looked up at Boone and then at Tanner, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like to join me?" Tanner looked at the empty chairs across from her. "If you don't mind the dog," he said. "I asked him first," she said. He sat. Connor and Tripp stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then they went somewhere else. Here is the thing about people like Harlan Wexford. They do not register small defeats. They register challenges to authority. And when a man in a flannel shirt and a dog intervenes in what they have already categorized as a routine acquisition of a preferred table, it does not read to them as someone defending an elderly woman's right to sit in a nice spot by the window. It reads as someone asserting dominance in their space. Harlan had been watching from the corner table. He finished his coffee. He said something to his wife in a low voice. She nodded once, the way she always nodded, preemptively, as insurance. Then he went to speak with the hotel manager. Tanner and Audrey had eggs. Boone had a biscuit that Audrey produced from her canvas tote, with the focused satisfaction of someone who had been planning this. She had been a high school librarian in Moncton for 31 years. She had outlived her husband by 6. She had 3 grandchildren, one of whom had recently discovered the saxophone, which she described with the careful diplomacy of someone choosing their words very precisely. Tanner told her he was in the Navy. She said her late husband had served in the Merchant Marine. She said it with the particular pride of someone who knows that branch gets less acknowledgement than it deserves. Tanner agreed. He told her Boone's full designation, military working dog, retired from active K-9 service, now certified as a psychiatric service animal. He said it plainly, without apology. Audrey asked what psychiatric service meant, and he told her that too, in the same flat, matter-of-fact voice, and she listened without the particular look people sometimes got, the one that was trying to rearrange itself into something supportive. She just nodded. "That makes sense," she said. "He seems like he pays attention." "He does," Tanner said. Boone, on cue, rested his chin on Audrey's knee. She laughed again, same laugh as the day before. Real. The hotel manager arrived at their table at 8:57. His name tag said Bertrand. He was polite in the way that hotel managers are trained to be polite when delivering information that both parties know is uncomfortable. He said there had been a concern raised about the dog in the dining area. Tanner produced the certification papers before Bertrand finished the sentence. He put them on the table. Bertrand looked at them. Looked at Tanner. "I understand," he said. "However, a guest has also indicated that he feels, that is, the concern raised was, the dog is certified under federal guidelines," Tanner said. "That supersedes hotel policy." "Yes," Bertrand said. "You're correct." He paused. He seemed to genuinely regret what he was about to say. "There is also a concern regarding, the guest in question has made a formal complaint." About an incident this morning at the hostess station. I asked a guest to keep a table he'd been assigned, Tanner said. That's all. Bertrand nodded slowly. The concern, as it's been characterized, is, who filed the complaint? Bertrand hesitated. He was a professional. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. There are 100 ways to make a quiet man feel like the problem in a room. Harlan Wexford knew most of them. He'd built a career on the particular skill of transforming reasonable requests into reasonable-sounding complaints, of making the person who pushed back look like the instigator. By noon, Tanner had been asked to keep Boone out of the lobby restaurant. By 2 o'clock, he'd received a written notice from hotel management, polite, formal, full of phrases like understandable concerns and guest experience standards, indicating that another guest had formally objected to the presence of the dog in common areas. At 2:15, Audrey knocked on his door. She had a look on her face that Tanner recognized. It was the look of someone who has been very patient for a very long time and has decided that today is the day they stop. That man spoke to me in the corridor, she said. Harlan Wexford. He told me I should consider whether I wanted to continue causing disruption. Tanner looked at her. He said that to you, he said. Yes. What did you say? Audrey held up her canvas tote. I told him I was going to have lunch at the restaurant on the terrace, and he could go wherever he liked. Boone sat at Tanner's feet while Tanner made the calls. The first call was to the Canadian Forces Legal Assistance Line. He had the number memorized. He explained the situation in concise, accurate terms. The officer on the other end asked 3 clarifying questions. Tanner answered them. The officer said she'd have documentation ready within the hour. The second call was to a former teammate, a man named by the radio call sign Spectre, whose actual name was irrelevant here, who was currently living in Ottawa and whose sister happened to work in federal accessibility compliance. Spectre listened for 90 seconds and then said, without inflection, "Want me to come up?" "Not yet," Tanner said. "Let me know." The third call was to a number Tanner hadn't dialed in over a year. It rang twice. The voice on the other end was the voice of his old commanding officer, Commander Hollins, who was now retired and spending his time, as far as Tanner could tell, fishing and being right about things. Tanner explained the situation. Hollins was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wexford. Harlan Wexford. The extraction guy? I don't know what he does. Petroleum extraction. He testified before a Senate committee in 2021. His company's been in 3 environmental hearings in the last 4 years. His lawyers are very good." A pause. "His lawyers are going to be a problem for you." "I know. But he's wrong. I know that too." Another pause. Then Hollins said something that he rarely said. He said, "Tell me how I can help." Audrey had lunch on the terrace. Tanner sat across from her. Boone lay under the table with his head on his paws and watched the St. Lawrence River the way he watched everything. Steadily, without urgency. Audrey told him about the summer she'd spent at a library exchange program in Glasgow 30 years ago. Tanner told her about a port call in Charlottetown that had lasted 3 days longer than planned because of weather, and how he'd spent most of it reading in a cafe near the water. She asked what he'd been reading. He said he couldn't remember, which was true, and she laughed at that. A waiter brought their food. Harlan Wexford appeared on the terrace at 1:15 with Connor and Tripp, and a man in a suit who was not a family member. The man in the suit was, as Tanner later confirmed, a lawyer. His name was Aldous Brennan. He was with a firm in Calgary that specialized in protecting the interests of people who had enough interests to require specialized protection. Harlan didn't approach the table. He looked at it. He looked at Tanner. He seemed to be calculating something. Tanner didn't look away. After a moment, Harlan went to a different table. The formal meeting happened at 3:30 in the hotel's oak-paneled meeting room, because Bertrand had decided that a structured conversation was preferable to a situation that was beginning to make the staff visibly anxious. Harlan sat across from Tanner. Brennan sat beside Harlan. Bertrand sat at the head of the table with the posture of a man who very much wanted to be somewhere else. Brennan led for the first 20 minutes. He was skilled. He spoke about guest experience and liability, and the hotel's obligations, and the discomfort experienced by his client. And he arranged these things into a structure that made it sound, if you listened without paying close attention, as if Tanner was the source of a problem rather than the response to one. Tanner listened without speaking. When Brennan finished, Tanner put 3 documents on the table. The first was the Federal Service Animal Certification, which Brennan had already been told about, and which he acknowledged with the practiced acknowledgement of a man who knows a thing is real, but intends to complicate it anyway. The second was a document from the Canadian Forces Legal Office, time-stamped from 2 hours ago, outlining the specific provisions of the Accessible Canada Act as they applied to certified service animals in commercial accommodations, including hotels, including the specific clause that made a hotel's internal guest complaint process insufficient grounds for removal. The third was a printed email. It was from Spector's sister, whose actual title was Senior Accessibility Compliance Officer with the Canadian Human Rights Commission. The email noted that she had been made aware of a potential violation at this property and would be following up through official channels within 72 hours. Brennan read all 3 documents. The room was quiet for a while. Harlan looked at Tanner. "You came here for a vacation," he said. "All of this over a table at breakfast." Tanner looked back. "You came here for a conference," he said. "All of this over a window seat." Harlan's jaw tightened. Audrey was minding her own business, Tanner said. That's all she was doing. There are people in this world who treat confrontation as a resource, something to be deployed, managed, redirected. There are other people for whom confrontation is simply a clarification of what was already true. Tanner was the second kind. He had learned, over a decade and a half of doing work that most people would never hear about, that the clearest thing you could do in any situation was name it accurately. Harlan Wexford was a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that things were named in ways that served him. He was encountering, perhaps for the first time in a long while, someone for whom that strategy had no traction. Bertrand resolved the situation with the efficiency of a man who has just understood how much exposure his employer has acquired in the last 24 hours. The formal complaint was withdrawn. The written notice to Tanner was rescinded. The dining room was accessible. The terrace was accessible. Tanner and Boone were welcome wherever the hotel's other guests were welcome, as had always been the case under applicable law. Harlan said nothing more. Brennan gathered his documents. Connor and Tripp, who had been seated outside the meeting room and had heard more than they probably intended to, were also quiet. Bertrand personally walked Tanner back to the lobby and apologized, which he did with evident sincerity and visible discomfort, both of which Tanner appreciated. He wasn't the problem. He'd been placed in a position that produced problems. That was a different thing. Audrey was in the lobby, in the same armchair by the fireplace where Tanner had first noticed her struggling with her purse. She had her book open. She looked up when he came in. "Well?" she said. "Fine," he said. She looked at Boone. Boone looked at her. "There's a concert in the ballroom tonight," she said. "String quartet. The concierge told me it's complimentary for hotel guests." She paused. "I know you probably have things to do." Tanner thought about the history of the Royal Canadian Navy, which was upstairs on the nightstand. "What time?" he said. 7. He nodded. She nodded. Boone sat between them and was still. Harlan Wexford checked out the following morning. His conference ran through the week, but he'd apparently decided, or Brennan had apparently advised him, that the cost-benefit of remaining was unfavorable. The front desk staff, several of whom had watched the events of the previous day with the quiet attention of people who spend their lives watching how guests treat each other, noted his departure without visible reaction, which is its own kind of reaction. Connor and Tripp left separately, 2 hours later, Tanner was on the terrace with his coffee when the car came for them. He didn't watch it leave. He was reading. The string quartet had played Haydn, and then something Tanner didn't recognize, and then, at Audrey's request, a piece she'd named to the cellist before the concert. A hymn, slow and plain and not trying to be anything other than what it was. She'd closed her eyes during it. Boone had lain very still on the floor beside her chair. Tanner had sat in a high-backed chair with his arms on the rests and watched the candles on the mantel and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing he was still learning to do. Afterward, she'd said, "My husband used to say that the only thing worth arguing about is what's worth keeping." She'd said it looking at her hands. "I used to think he meant it philosophically. Now I think he meant it quite literally." Tanner hadn't said anything. He didn't think she'd needed him to. On the last morning, he found a note under his door. Paper, not a card from the hotel. Notebook paper, folded once. "Thank you for sitting down." Audrey folded it back up and put it in the front pocket of his duffel, next to the certification papers. Boone was already at the door, waiting. Tanner pulled on his jacket, checked the room once, a habit, not anxiety, the difference being intent. Picked up the bag. He looked at Boone. "Ready?" Boone turned toward the door. They went out. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world making very little noise and leaving it, in small ways that rarely get recorded anywhere, somewhat better than they found it. They don't usually know that they're doing it. They're usually just trying to get to the next thing, the next port call, the next briefing, the next cup of coffee in a dining room where they'd rather be left alone. Sometimes they sit down at a stranger's table by a window, because it is the correct thing to do. Sometimes they stand in the way of something small and ugly, precisely because they have spent years standing in the way of things that were much larger. Boone walked through the Chateau Frontenac's revolving door and stepped into the October air and sneezed once, decisively, which Tanner had long ago decided was his opinion of cities in general. Tanner smiled, just slightly. He adjusted his bag and they walked toward the street. And the morning was cold and clear, and whatever came next was waiting, and neither of them were in any particular hurry to get there.